As many of you know, that we talked a lot about what's going on in North American OECD countries, but the reality is that China and India are the first and third largest emitters out there and growing very rapidly. So in many cases, it's a very relevant discussion finding out what's going on there. We are privileged to have Kate Gordon from Paulson, an expert on China, and TK Kurian from Wipro, who can talk about what's going on in India. And today we wanted to explore some of the challenges and opportunities and contrast what's going on in the two geographies across power, transport, and industry. So Kate, I'd love to start with you. In March of this year, the 13th five-year plan was announced, an important document, and it involved a lot of ratcheting up of standards that are already quite tight and aggressive. What gives you hope or not about that piece of legislation?
Well, I think it's exciting that China has, at a very high level, said we will reduce our energy intensity per unit of GDP. So that's not just about carbon, that's not just about any other particular pollutant, but it really is a commitment to decouple GDP growth and energy consumption, which is a big deal. And so that is ultimately integrated through the rest of the economy and really interesting. I think what's exciting right now to me is what China's trying to do on renewables in particular. There are very high level renewable goals that are being set and a lot of work being done to try to figure out how to integrate renewables onto the grid that could, if done well, and that's a caveat, be a real model to the rest of the world. So I think it's an exciting time.
And we'll come back to some of that because I think there are some challenges. TK, I read that in China, global or coal consumption last year in 2015 went down by 3.7%, which is sort of extraordinary. In India, I think you might have a slightly more jaundiced view of how this is going to play out. Do you want to talk through some of the challenges that you see?
Absolutely. So I'll just give you a quick perspective of India itself so that you can understand and you can put that in the context of my comments. India today is roughly about 1.3 billion people. 20% of the world's population lives in India. Yet we consume roughly about 6% of the primary energy that's available. Now, for development, if you fast forward up to 2030, India has to create 150 million jobs just to keep the population that's educated at work. Out of the 150 million jobs that are going to come, roughly about 100 million, which is what the government has put a stake in the ground on, is going to come from manufacturing. Roughly about 20 million is going to come from infrastructure, and the balance is going to come from services. That's broadly how the mix is today laid out. I doubt where the 100 million will come. I think it'll probably be closer to about 50 or 60. But overall, if you don't get 150 million, the social tension in society is going to grow. If you look at energy consumption per capita, today, India probably consumes about 1.1 kilowatt hour per person, which is extremely low. Now, for industrialization, this number is going to go up. So in terms of scale, for the first 65 years after independence, India added roughly about 250 gigawatts in terms of generating capacity. Fast forward to 2030, to keep industrialization at this level, we need to add roughly about 900 gigawatts of power. And by the way, this is base load power. Out of which roughly about 300 will come from renewables and 600 will come from the good old-fashioned coal. In 2030, India would be the largest consumer of coal in the world and also the largest importer of coal in the world. If you're not able to kick in the renewables required, the 300 gigawatts that we need, we will be in a situation where we would be emitting roughly about 5 gigatons of carbon every year. So that's the scale of the problem. So the choice is really between development and sustainability. And I think the biggest issue for countries like us is other countries in the world have gone through a development cycle where they've had this benefit. When it comes to India, the biggest issues that politicians have is how do they go and tell the people that sustainability is important vis-a-vis pure development. I think that's the dichotomy that we face up to every day.
So that's a optimistic view of the future. India going from 3 gigatons to 8 gigatons by 2030. Now, Kate, with China's approach, which is more top-down, shall we say?
Slightly.
It is. I think it's also true that it's not without issues or challenges and some contradictions in the way that they're thinking about doing that. What do you see as some of the big challenges ahead there?
Well, there are many. As you said, China does these 5-year plans. They're very, very much from the top down. They're very centralized. Technically, that should mean it all works out easily because everyone who's in, all the mayors and governors are also members of the party. So a party statement should trickle down. But operationally, it's very complicated. So for instance, on the renewable targets, there is a law in China that the utilities, that grid operators must buy all renewable energy coming into the grid. However, they have already put together contracts with the coal producers to buy a certain amount of coal every year. So by definition, what happens, or in reality, what happens is that coal gets first on the grid, in the dispatch order. And Dickens said earlier, and it's true, there's 15% average curtailment of wind and solar in China right now, up to 30% in some parts of the country. That's a dispatch order issue. It's a transmission issue. There are different quotas for different regions that are met at different times. It is not an easy system to implement, and there's a lot that needs to happen there. There's a couple other big challenges I'd point to. One is that is sort of an infrastructure challenge. So the head of the People's Bank of China, Ma Jun, recently said that the government would only be able to pay for about 10 to 15% of the costs of the big energy transition that has to happen to meet the goals that China has put out in the Paris agreements and beyond. Who pays for the rest of the infrastructure? I think this is a big question in general when we look at developing economies. Developed economies went through a big infrastructure development at a time when government put a lot more money into those things, whether it was for national security with the highway system, whether it was for mostly for national security with other systems. We don't operate on those models exactly anymore. So how do you get the private capital in, particularly for the infrastructure that sort of everybody uses and no one wants to pay for, right? And then finally, just something that I've been thinking about a lot. I've been thinking a lot about the steel industry in China because, as you've probably seen, and many of you know well, there's an overcapacity issue right now. So China is closing down a massive amount of steel and coal right now. They're looking at 2 million jobs in coal and steel going away pretty immediately, and 1.3 million in coal and the other in steel, and closing down all kinds of plants. And the question, and China is, of course, trying to move toward a more service-driven economy. Right now, 70% of China's carbon emissions from energy come from the industrial sector. So they're trying to move toward a more service economy. That should be more sustainable. India is trying to move toward more manufacturing. The question on the table, sort of for all of us thinking about, the Paris agreements, the whole world is in this together, is where does all that go? Everything everyone has talked about today, whether it's wind turbines or solar systems or other innovations, most of those things have aluminum, steel, cement in them. Who makes those things in a world that's decided to be carbon constrained? And how do we avoid kind of the race to the bottom, continuing on and on and on, and then sort of waking up one day and saying, oh, we still have all these emissions, what do we do with them? We have to think today about making that more efficient, think today about the industrial sector, I think much more proactively than China certainly is doing.
Now, one of the drivers, sometimes climate is less of a strong driver in these geographies, but air pollution can be a significant driver. I was wondering, TK, it sounds like there's more legislation appearing in cities, the role of the courts or the legal system even may be becoming more powerful than the politicians. What are some of the dynamics you're seeing there?
So in India, it's actually very interesting because if you look at the top 5 cities of the world in terms of pollution, 4 of them sit in India. So the scale of the problem is massive because with urbanization happening more and more, and we expect that in the next, by 2030, roughly between 60 to 65% of the population would move to cities. So given that, I think what happens is the politicians certainly don't want to take that on because it means jobs and everything else that follows. So in India, what's happening today is that the court system is jumping in because the constitution guarantees the right to life, which means that clean air and clean water are requirements that are guaranteed by the constitution. So the Supreme Court recently has just banned all diesel cars in Delhi. It created chaos because most of the taxis that run there are run on diesel. Similarly, you cannot buy a diesel car more than 2 liters. So there's a lot of activities like this which are going on, which are primarily driven by constitutional rights that are guaranteed to people. So you're going to see more and more of this. Similarly, we saw big agitation happening for the nuclear power plants. And it happened for a very strange reason. It happened because when people went to court, the court asked them to prove, the companies that are setting up the nuclear power plants, asked them to prove that the turbines and the generators were actually, they had been tested. And surprisingly, what happened was that some of the newer models had not been tested in scale and for life, so obviously they couldn't qualify. So a lot of them went into litigation. So there are a bunch of issues around this which are now affecting investment. On the other hand, if you look at coal, nobody asks you any questions. It's easy because people have seen it before. It's easy to people understand what it means. The consequences of that are not very well understood even by the judicial system.
Just on this air quality point, just something we see playing out, I think it's an important issue in both countries, is that the immediate political pressure to deal with the air quality versus the long-term diplomatic pressure to deal with climate change. These things can be in conflict. So the Beijing mayor recently, who's very high up in the party actually, made a decision to move 100 manufacturing plants out of Beijing to meet his air quality quotas that are set by the central government. Where did he move them? He moved them to Hebei, which is next door. So technically, that doesn't do much for you from a sort of a overall regional air quality or a climate perspective, but it does meet these very specific goals. And I think we see that a lot. I mean, the air quality is a real political pressure in these two countries.
Yep. I was wondering, and wanted to ask you, Kate, and then you, TK, about what we might see from an export situation. I mean, in places like solar, we've seen a lot of Chinese exports, and in a lot of other technologies. If you look at someone like State Grid, which is the largest utility in the world, has arguably the most advanced HVDC high voltage DC technology, 1.1 megavolts. They can transport with 4 to 5% losses over several thousand kilometers. Do you see that as, and I understand they've recently bought other grids outside of China. What do you see as that dynamic going forward? Will we see them buying up grids in the US?
Well, they are really trying to be a big world player. I mean, State Grid, the chairman, Liu, who just actually resigned, but the chairman up until very recently, had a global energy web or a global energy internet plan, which really was about high voltage transmission all over the world and connecting everybody through these transmission lines. Certainly a lot of that building is happening in China, and as you said elsewhere, they bought the grid in the Philippines. They're looking at other countries. They have tried to get into the US market and failed for national security reasons, but they are very, very proactive on this point, and it's an area where you really see that sort of Chinese economic imperialism happening. And I think it's important to watch. I mean, high voltage transmission is in fact an important part of this energy conversation that we're having. But what State Grid is struggling with, at least in China, is balancing that with the need to, for instance, better integrate across regions so that they're not losing a bunch of renewable power from their renewable demonstration zones and just sort of letting it all fall off because they're not doing a great job balancing. So I think State Grid is going to be more and more visible.
TK, from an export point of view, microgrids or more of a distributed approach, Adani, Reliance, Wipro, will we see kind of exports in this sector?
It's very unlikely because the scale of the problem in India and the market that it presents is a massive opportunity in India itself. Yeah. Just to give you an example, like I said, India needs roughly about 2.9 trillion by 2030 just to deploy and just to deploy enough systems on the ground to make sure that we meet the energy requirements in 2030. Half of it is going to go into the grid, and half of it is going to go into generation. And roughly about 0.9 trillion is going to go into energy saving. India's done a lot over the past couple of years in terms of renewables. Initially, it started off with hydro. I mean, that's the way, if you classify hydro as renewable. But solar has picked up substantially over the past couple of years. 5 years ago, the total solar capacity in the country was close to about 30 megawatts. Today, installed is 6.7 gigawatts. So there's been a substantial change over the past couple of years. But we have to do much, much more. The problem that we have in India is that our base load has to be supported. And solar just creates more imbalance in the grid, and the grid is today not ready to take that up. So till we manage the grid effectively, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to deploy solar.
Very similar problem.
I'd like to open up for one question before closing comments here. Who has the microphone? Yep. Yep, over there. Yes.
I'm Mike Hart with Sierra Energy. I'm bringing up an issue about waste to energy again. TK, I appreciate your comments about India. What I haven't understood about India is based on the population that's there and the waste that's currently generated in India per person. If you were to take just the waste that's currently generated in India, you would create more than 900 gigawatts worth of electricity at emissions significantly lower than natural gas, and you would offset significantly more than 4 to 5 gigatons of greenhouse gas in the form of not only the methane that's currently going into the atmosphere, which is 84 times worse than carbon dioxide, because it's going up there now, but also you would be building clean facilities instead of emission spewing coal-fired power plants. And it's profitable. So why isn't there more of an initiative in India to try and take advantage of the technology that's available?
It's a very good question. And the problem is this. If you look at it, the central government does not have any control over the cities. The local municipalities run the cities. And most of the waste that's generated is actually managed by those guys. And they don't have the money to kind of invest. Power is outside their domain. So they're very happy going and dumping stuff into landfills rather than kind of using that effectively to do something, generate power with it, for example. But there is a policy change that's underway. In New Delhi right now, there's a big initiative to use waste. In Bangalore, what's happening is that people have now decided that a lot of farmers have gone up in arms because they don't want to kind of have their land close to the landfills. So there is pressure now, especially political pressure, to start that. My own sense is it'll take a couple of years, but we'll get there. We'll certainly start that.
This is just an area where I see some hope, particularly in steel in China. Steel, right now, China is only at 6% recycled steel. That's very low. The US uses around 60%. And everyone always says, well, there's no steel floating around in the Chinese economy. But in fact, the buildings that were built in the 80s are now falling down. So there is increasingly steel in the Chinese economy. As a centralized economy, that is a place where China could really put some standards in place and actually make a big difference in its own emissions.
So, okay, that sounded, you've ended on a glass half full note.
That's my half full note, yeah.
TK, glass half full, glass half empty.
I think the scale of the problem that we have has to be recognized. While we can see it as a glass half full, there's a massive challenge out there for countries like us to get growth. If we can't get growth, fundamentally, democracies don't survive. And I think that's the fundamental issue that we face, especially in growth and employment.
Perfect.
And that's what our politicians are worried about.
Developing countries in 20 minutes. There you have it.
On that note, thanks to our guests.
Thank you.
Thanks.